In 1789, France was a kingdom of contradictions, where opulent palaces cast long shadows over streets filled with starving, desperate people. The call for liberté, égalité, fraternité was a spark in a tinderbox, igniting a revolution that promised to burn away the old world of tyranny. On July 14th, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress and a hated symbol of royal despotism. Its fall was a tremor that shook every throne in Europe. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, once the divine rulers of France, watched their world crumble, becoming prisoners in their own capital. Amidst the chaos, a lawyer from Arras named Maximilien Robespierre began to speak, his words weaving a tapestry of virtue, purity, and terror. The revolution grew more radical, fueled by foreign wars, internal revolts, and the constant fear of counter-revolutionaries hiding in plain sight. The September massacres were a horrifying prelude to the coming storm, as mobs dragged thousands of suspected traitors from prisons and butchered them in the streets. The monarchy was officially abolished, and France was declared a republic. But this new birth was attended by the specter of violence, and the question of what to do with the former king loomed over the nation. The trial of citizen Louis Capet, formerly King Louis XVI, was a spectacle of revolutionary justice. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, a political necessity to ensure the revolution could not turn back. There was no room for a king, living or dead, in the new republic, and his existence was a constant threat to the fragile government. His fate would serve as a chilling message to the crowned heads of Europe. On a cold January morning in 1793, Louis XVI was taken to the Place de la Révolution. He faced the massive, silent crowd with a quiet dignity that surprised many. His final words, attempting to declare his innocence, were deliberately drowned out by a drumroll ordered by the guards. The moment was a point of no return for France, a final, bloody severing from its past. The blade of the guillotine fell, and a great cheer erupted from the crowd as the executioner held the king's head aloft. It was a moment of grisly triumph for the revolutionaries, but it also plunged France into a deeper and more violent phase of its transformation. The death of the king did not bring stability. It only intensified the paranoia and the internal power struggles, creating a vacuum that more extreme voices would rush to fill. With the king gone, political factions in the convention battled for control. The moderate Girondins clashed with the radical Jacobins, led by figures like Robespierre, Danton, and Marat. The Jacobins argued that the revolution was in mortal danger, threatened by enemies both at home and abroad. They claimed that only through extreme, ruthless measures could the Republic be saved from its many foes. Jean-Paul Marat, a radical journalist, was a voice of pure, unadulterated fury. From his newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, he called for blood, relentlessly demanding the heads of anyone he deemed an enemy of the revolution. His paranoid writings fueled the fires of suspicion, turning citizens against each other and creating an atmosphere where accusations were as deadly as daggers. In response to mounting pressures, foreign invasion, civil war in the Vendée region, and economic crisis, the Jacobins made their move. They established the Committee of Public Safety in April 1793. Initially intended as a wartime cabinet, it quickly morphed into a de facto dictatorship, a collective executive with near-absolute power to defend the revolution by any means necessary. The Girondins were purged from the convention, arrested, and declared enemies of the state. This act consolidated Jacobin power and marked the beginning of the end for any organized political opposition. Robespierre and his allies now had a clear path to implement their radical vision. The purge sent a clear message. Dissent would not be tolerated, and the revolution would now speak with one unified and terrifying voice. The assassination of Marat by Charlotte Corday, a Girondin sympathizer, had the opposite effect she intended. Instead of ending the bloodshed, it transformed Marat into a revolutionary martyr. His death was used by the Jacobins as proof of a vast conspiracy against the Republic, justifying an even more severe crackdown on all suspected enemies. The friend of the people became more powerful in death than he ever was in life. With Robespierre as its dominant voice, the Committee of Public Safety declared that terror is the order of the day. This was not random violence, but an official government policy. It was a calculated strategy to use fear as a weapon to forge a new republic of virtue. They believed that to create a nation of good citizens, they first had to eliminate all the bad ones, and they would be the sole arbiters of who was who. The Law of Suspects was passed in September 1793, and it was a masterpiece of totalitarian legislation. It defined suspects in such broad and vague terms that virtually anyone could be arrested. Those who had not consistently demonstrated their devotion to the revolution, those who spoke with ambivalence, or even those who were simply not enthusiastic enough, could be condemned. The law cast a net of terror over the entire nation. The Revolutionary Tribunal was established as the engine of the terror. It was a court designed not for justice, but for rapid conviction. The accused were denied proper legal counsel, trials were swift and often lasted mere minutes, and the only possible verdicts were acquittal or death. The presumption of innocence was a casualty of the revolution, replaced by the certainty of guilt. The guillotine, once hailed as a humane method of execution, became the symbol of the terror's industrial-scale slaughter. Set up in the Place de la Révolution, its rhythmic fall was a daily spectacle of death. The crowds, known as the tricoteurs, would knit while they watched heads roll, a chilling testament to how normalized the violence had become. The thirst for blood became a grotesque form of public entertainment. Marie Antoinette was one of the terror's first high-profile victims. No longer a queen, but the widow Capet, she was subjected to a sham trial filled with vile, baseless accusations. Her journey to the scaffold was in a common wooden cart, a stark contrast to the royal carriages of her past. She faced her death with a stoicism that denied her executioners the satisfaction of her fear. The execution of the Girondin deputies followed soon after. 21 of them were sent to the guillotine together, a grim procession of the revolution's own children being devoured by their creation. As they went to their deaths, they sang La Marseillaise, the revolutionary anthem, their voices defiant until the very last one was silenced by the blade. It was a chilling symphony of ideals being slaughtered by fanaticism. The terror was not confined to Paris. In the provinces, it was often even more brutal and indiscriminate. In Lyon, which had rebelled against Jacobin rule, the guillotine was deemed too slow. Prisoners were lined up in fields and executed en masse with cannon fire, a method called mitraillade. The Rhône River was said to have run red with the blood of the condemned. In Nantes, the representative on mission Jean-Baptiste Carrier unleashed a particular horror known as the noyades, or mass drownings. Priests, women, and children were herded onto specially designed barges, which were then towed to the middle of the Loire River and scuttled. These horrific events were cynically referred to as Republican baptisms, a depraved twist on a sacred rite. Paranoia became a way of life. A careless word, a private letter, a forgotten revolutionary cockade, any of these could lead to a denunciation. Children informed on their parents, and neighbors spied on neighbors. The certificates of civism, documents proving one's revolutionary loyalty, became essential for survival. Fear was a constant, suffocating presence in every home and on every street. A campaign of de-Christianization swept across France, another front in the war to remake society. Churches were desecrated and closed, their bells melted down for cannons. Religious icons were destroyed and replaced with busts of revolutionary martyrs like Marat. A new, atheistic cult of reason was promoted, with bizarre ceremonies held in cathedrals like Notre Dame, which was rededicated as a temple of reason. Robespierre, however, disliked the atheism of the cult of reason. He believed it would lead to moral decay. He envisioned a new state religion, the cult of the supreme being, a deistic faith that acknowledged a creator god and the immortality of the soul. This was his attempt to provide a moral foundation for his republic of virtue, a civic religion that would bind the nation together under his guidance. As the terror intensified, it began to consume the revolutionaries themselves. The radical faction known as the Hébertists, who had championed de-Christianization and were popular with the Parisian working class, were seen by Robespierre as a threat. He accused them of being foreign agents and moral degenerates, and swiftly had them arrested and sent to the guillotine. Their crime was being too radical for the man who defined radicalism. Next, Robespierre turned on the Indulgents, a faction led by his former friend, Georges Danton. Danton, a charismatic and larger-than-life figure of the revolution, had begun to argue that the terror had gone too far and that it was time for clemency and a return to normality. For Robespierre, this was a sign of weakness and corruption, a betrayal of the revolution's principles. The arrest of Danton and his ally, Camille Desmoulins, sent a shockwave through Paris. If a giant of the revolution like Danton could fall, then no one was safe. During his trial, Danton was a force of nature, his booming voice echoing through the courtroom as he defended himself with ferocious energy. But the outcome was predetermined. The court was ordered to silence him and proceed to the verdict. On his way to the guillotine, Danton's cart passed by Robespierre's house. He allegedly bellowed, "Robespierre, you will follow me." On the scaffold, his last words to the executioner were, "Show my head to the people. It is well worth seeing." With Danton's death, Robespierre had eliminated his last significant rival. He now stood alone, the undisputed and feared master of the French Republic. With all opposition crushed, the terror entered its most intense phase, the Great Terror. The law of 22 Betrayal was passed, stripping the accused of any remaining rights. Trials became mere formalities for identification. The definition of enemy of the people was expanded to include anyone who sought to inspire discouragement. The guillotines of Paris began to work faster than ever before, and the tumbrils carting the condemned became a constant presence. The prisons of Paris were overflowing, hellish places where death was a constant companion. People from all walks of life, aristocrats, priests, shopkeepers, peasants, were crammed together in squalid conditions. Every day, a guard would enter and read out a list of names of those who were to be taken to the tribunal. This daily ritual, the appel nominal, was a moment of supreme terror as each prisoner listened, praying not to hear their own name called. The air in Paris grew thick with the stench of blood. The sheer number of executions at the Place de la Révolution created a public health problem. The ground became so saturated with blood that it was difficult for animals to cross, and the smell permeated the entire neighborhood. The guillotine had to be moved several times, a grim testament to the scale of the slaughter during the Great Terror. Robespierre's power seemed absolute, but he was becoming increasingly isolated. His obsession with virtue and his constant threats of new purges terrified even his closest colleagues on the Committee of Public Safety. They saw the execution of Danton and knew that any one of them could be next. The incorruptible was now seen as a tyrant, a man whose paranoia was insatiable. The festival of the Supreme Being in June 1794 was to be Robespierre's crowning achievement. He orchestrated a massive public ceremony in Paris, with himself as the central figure, the high priest of his new religion. Dressed in a sky-blue coat and holding a bouquet of flowers, he led a procession to an artificial mountain. For many observers, this was not the act of a statesman, but the megalomaniacal display of a would-be dictator. His colleagues on the committee watched his performance at the festival with growing alarm and contempt. They whispered that he was setting himself up as a god or a king. The festival, intended to unite France under his moral vision, only served to crystallize the opposition against him. The fear he had so expertly wielded was now turning back on him as his enemies began to plot in the shadows. On the 8th of Thermidor, July 26th, Robespierre appeared before the National Convention and delivered a long, rambling, and ominous speech. He spoke of a vast conspiracy against the Republic, a final plot by traitors that needed to be purged. Crucially, however, he refused to name the conspirators he was accusing. This was a fatal mistake. By refusing to name names, he had made every man in the room feel as though the guillotine was hanging over his own head. The instinct for self-preservation finally overrode the fear he had instilled. That night, his opponents, a fragile coalition of former allies, terrified moderates and rival terrorists, met in secret. They knew that if they did not strike first, they would be dead by morning. The next day, the 9th of Thermidor, the trap was sprung. When Robespierre's ally, Saint-Just, tried to speak, he was shouted down. A prearranged chorus of deputies began screaming, "Down with the tyrant!" Robespierre tried to speak in his own defense, but his voice was drowned out by the noise. The man who had silenced so many was now himself silenced. The president of the convention, Collot de Herbois, one of the main conspirators, refused to give Robespierre the floor. The chamber descended into chaos as accusations flew. Finally, a little-known deputy shouted the words that sealed Robespierre's fate. "I demand the arrest of the tyrant." The motion was passed with a thunderous roar of approval. Robespierre, his younger brother Augustin, Saint-Just, Couthon, and other allies were arrested and taken away. However, the jailers at the prison refused to accept them, still fearing Robespierre's power. His supporters in the Paris Commune managed to free him, and they gathered at the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, in a desperate attempt to rally their forces and launch a counterattack against the convention. But the people of Paris did not rise to defend him. The city was exhausted by the terror and weary of the endless bloodshed. The convention acted decisively, declaring Robespierre and his followers outlaws, which meant they could be executed without trial. Troops loyal to the convention stormed the Hôtel de Ville in the middle of the night. In the chaos of the raid, Robespierre was shot in the jaw. Whether it was a botched suicide attempt or a shot from one of the soldiers is still debated by historians. The bullet shattered his jaw, leaving him unable to speak, a grotesquely ironic fate for a man whose power had resided in his words. He was found lying in a pool of his own blood, the incorruptible finally and brutally broken. The following day, the 10th of Thermidor, it was Robespierre's turn to face the guillotine. He was taken to the Place de la Révolution, along with 21 of his closest followers. The journey was a torment, as the crowds that had once feared him now screamed insults and curses. He remained silent, his broken jaw wrapped in a bloody bandage. On the scaffold, the executioner ripped the bandage from Robespierre's jaw, causing him to let out a single, agonized scream. It was the last sound he ever made. A moment later, the blade fell, silencing the architect of the terror forever. The crowd erupted in a massive cheer that reportedly lasted for 15 minutes, a release of all the pent-up fear and hatred that had defined his reign. The fall of Robespierre marked the end of the reign of terror. The period that followed, known as the Thermidorian reaction, saw a dismantling of the machinery of terror. The Committee of Public Safety was stripped of its power, the Revolutionary Tribunal was reorganized, and the prisons were opened, releasing thousands of surviving suspects. France took its first exhausted breath of relief. The Thermidorians, who were themselves revolutionaries and regicides, were not seeking to restore the old monarchy. They were trying to create a more stable, conservative republic, free from the bloody excesses of the Jacobins. They purged the most prominent surviving terrorists, holding them responsible for the bloodshed, even though many of the Thermidorians had been complicit themselves. The legacy of the Reign of Terror is complex and deeply disturbing. It resulted in the deaths of an estimated 40,000 people, with hundreds of thousands more arrested. It stands as a chilling warning of how a revolution founded on the noble principles of liberty and equality can descend into a paranoid bloodbath. It demonstrated that the pursuit of a perfect, virtuous society can be used to justify the most horrific atrocities. Robespierre himself remains a deeply controversial figure. Was he a monstrous tyrant, a bloodthirsty dictator who hijacked the revolution for his own power? Or was he a tragic idealist, a man so devoted to his vision of a virtuous republic that he believed any measure, no matter how brutal, was justified to achieve it? The truth is likely a terrifying combination of both. The terror ultimately failed to create the Republic of Virtue. Instead, it created a nation traumatized by fear and exhausted by violence. This exhaustion and instability would eventually pave the way for the rise of another figure, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, who would promise order and stability at the price of the very liberty the revolution had sought to achieve. The story of the Reign of Terror is not just a dark chapter in French history. It is a timeless and universal cautionary tale. It reveals the darkness that can lie within human nature when ideology becomes absolute and compassion is sacrificed for purity. It shows how easily the cries for justice can become screams of vengeance, and how the road to utopia can lead directly to a mass grave. The guillotine's shadow stretched far beyond the borders of France, casting a pall over the very idea of popular revolution for generations. It forced a terrifying question upon the world. What is the true price of liberty? The Reign of Terror provided one of the most brutal and bloody answers in human history, an answer written in the blood of patriots and tyrants, innocents and guilty alike, all consumed by the same insatiable machine.